The morning of July 19th, 1944, near Kagny, Normandy, Lieutenant William Cotton of the 2nd Northamptonshire Yeomanry sat in the commander's position of his Cromwell tank, watching the tree line 400 yards ahead. His crew had been in France for 6 weeks. They had seen what German armor could do. They had seen Shermans burning. They had seen the wreckage of reconnaissance units that had pushed too far ahead. And now, through the early morning mist rising from the wheat fields, they could see the distinctive angular shape of a Panther tank, hull down behind an earthen berm, its long 75mm gun traversing slowly across the British advance. Cotton's gunner, Trooper James Metcalfe, had already identified the target. The question was not whether they had seen the Panther. The question was what they could possibly do about it. The Cromwell's 75mm gun could not penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at any range where the fighter, Cromwell itself, would survive. The mathematics were simple and unforgiving. The Panther could kill them from over a mile away. They could not harm the Panther from any practical combat distance, and yet they were ordered to advance. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What happened in the next few minutes would challenge everything British tank crews thought they understood about armored combat against superior opponents. It would reveal a vulnerability in German tank design that no one had deliberately targeted before, and it would spread through British armored regiments as tactical knowledge passed from crew to crew, changing how Cromwell and Sherman crews approached engagements they were supposed to lose. The Panther was, by every technical measure, a superior tank. Its armor was thicker. Its gun was more powerful. Its optics were better. German crews knew this. British crews knew this. The engagement should have been over before it began. But wars are not fought by statistics alone. They are fought by men who must find ways to survive and win, even when the equipment tables say they should not. And sometimes, in the chaos of combat, someone discovers that the enemy's greatest strength conceals an exploitable weakness. This is the story of how British tank crews learned to fight Panthers not by matching their firepower, but by taking away the one thing that made German technical superiority meaningful: the ability to see. Operation Overlord had succeeded in establishing Allied forces in Normandy, but 6 weeks after D-Day, the breakout from the beachhead remained frustratingly slow. British Second Army, under General Miles Dempsey, faced determined German resistance anchored by formations that included some of the most formidable armored units in the Wehrmacht. Among these were panzer divisions equipped with the Panzerkampfwagen 5, known universally as the Panther. The Panther had entered service in 1943, designed specifically to counter the Soviet 34. By the summer of 1944, it had been refined through several variants. The AUSF-G model, which British forces encountered in Normandy, represented the culmination of German tank design philosophy. Overwhelming firepower, combined with excellent protection and adequate mobility. The tank weighed 45 tons. Its frontal armor measured 80mm on the glacis, sloped at 55 degrees to provide effective protection equivalent to approximately 140mm against anti-tank rounds. The turret front was 110mm thick, sloped at rounded angles that increased effective thickness further. The Panther's main armament, the 7.5cm Kampfwagen Kanone 42, with a barrel length of 70 calibers, was one of the most effective tank guns of the war. It could fire armor-piercing rounds at a muzzle velocity of 3,000 feet per second, giving it penetration capabilities that far exceeded anything the Western Allies mounted on their medium tanks. At 1,000 yards, the Panther's gun could penetrate 138mm of armor plate. At 2,000 yards, it could still penetrate 107mm. These were not theoretical numbers. They were verified performance figures that meant the Panther could destroy any British or American medium tank at ranges where those tanks could not effectively fight back. British armored regiments in Normandy were equipped primarily with 2 types of tanks: the American-built M4 Sherman and the British Cromwell. The Cromwell had been designed as a cruiser tank, emphasizing speed and mobility over armor protection. It was powered by a Rolls-Royce Meteor engine, a derivative of the Merlin aircraft engine that powered Spitfires and Hurricanes. This gave the Cromwell excellent automotive performance. It could reach 38 miles per hour on roads, making it one of the fastest tanks in service. But speed meant nothing when facing an opponent who could kill you before you got close enough to shoot back. The Cromwell Mark IV, the most common variant in Normandy, mounted a 75mm gun, designated the Ordnance Quick-Firing 75mm. This was actually a rebored version of the British 6-pounder gun, modified to fire American 75mm ammunition for logistics simplicity. The gun could fire armor-piercing shot at approximately 2,000 feet per second. At 500 yards, under ideal conditions, it could penetrate approximately 76 millimeters of vertical armor plate. Against sloped armor, penetration decreased significantly. Against a Panther's frontal armor, the Cromwell's gun was effectively useless. Even flank shots at the Panther's side armor, which measured 40 to 50 millimeters but was also sloped, required close range and precise shot placement to achieve penetration. The Cromwell's own armor provided equally inadequate protection. The frontal hull armor measured 76 millimeters at the thickest point, but much of this was vertical or lightly sloped, reducing its effective protection. The turret front was also 76 millimeters. This was sufficient against most German anti-tank guns at medium range, but completely inadequate against the Panther's gun. A Panther could penetrate a Cromwell's frontal armor at distances exceeding 2,000 yards. The British tank would be destroyed before its crew even knew they were under fire. British tank crews understood these numbers. They had been briefed on German armor capabilities. They had seen the after-action reports from earlier engagements. Some crews had survived encounters with Panthers by pure luck shots that missed, mechanical failures in German tanks, or battlefield confusion that allowed them to withdraw. But the consensus among British armored units was clear. If you encountered a Panther in a Cromwell or even in a Sherman, your best option was to call for artillery support, airstrikes, or heavier British tanks like the Churchill or the 17-pounder armed Sherman Firefly. You did not engage a Panther directly unless you had no other choice. British armored doctrine in 1944 emphasized combined arms coordination and exploitation of breakthrough, not tank versus tank combat. Cruiser tanks like the Cromwell were meant to exploit gaps in enemy lines, pursue retreating forces, and conduct rapid advances once infantry and heavy tanks had broken through prepared defenses. Tank destroyers and specialized anti-tank units were supposed to handle enemy armor. But doctrine written in peacetime training grounds encounters reality on the battlefield, and reality in Normandy meant that Cromwell crews frequently found themselves facing German tanks in circumstances where support was unavailable, delayed, or already engaged elsewhere. The psychological impact of facing Panthers was significant. Trooper Ken Tout, who served as a gunner in a Sherman Firefly with the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, later wrote about the gut-level fear that came with seeing a Panther's distinctive profile. The tank was instantly recognizable: the long gun, the sloped armor, the angular turret. Experienced crews could identify a Panther at incredible distances just by silhouette, and seeing one meant immediate danger. German tank crews, by mid-1944, were often experienced veterans. Many had fought in Russia. They knew their equipment was superior. They used it with skill and confidence. British crews developed various tactics for survival. Some relied on speed, attempting to close distance rapidly and get to the Panther's flanks where the Cromwell's gun might achieve penetration. This was desperately dangerous. It required crossing open ground under fire from a gun that could kill you with a single hit. Others attempted to use terrain, positioning themselves hull down and waiting for the Panther to expose its flanks while maneuvering. This required patience, good positioning, and luck. Still others simply avoided engagement when possible, reporting Panther positions and continuing their assigned missions while leaving the German tank for specialized units to handle. What almost no one considered, in those early weeks after D-Day, was the vulnerability of the Panther's vision equipment. German tank design philosophy emphasized crew efficiency and situational awareness. Panthers were equipped with excellent optics. The commander's cupola featured 7 periscopes providing near 360-degree vision. The gunner had a binocular termed the Elfernrohr 9 telescopic sight for precision aiming. The driver had periscopes and a vision port. These vision devices were critical to the Panther's effectiveness. A tank that cannot see cannot fight, regardless of how thick its armor or how powerful its gun. The vision equipment, by necessity, created weak points in the armor. Periscopes protruded through armored housings. Vision blocks required openings in the armor. The commander's cupola, raised to provide better observation, was less heavily armored than the main turret. These were not secrets, they were visible features of the tank's design. But they were not considered primary targets. Anti-tank doctrine focused on achieving penetration of the main armor to destroy the tank completely. Hitting periscopes or vision blocks was seen as a waste of ammunition damage without decisive effect. But what if decisive effect did not require destroying the tank? What if rendering it unable to fight effectively was sufficient? These questions had not been seriously explored in British tactical doctrine. They would be answered not through formal study or training, but through desperate improvisation by crews who needed to survive encounters they were not equipped to win through conventional means. The Cromwell Mark IV that Lieutenant Cotton commanded weighed 27 3/4 tons in combat configuration. The crew consisted of 5 men: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and hull gunner, who also served as radio operator. Unlike the cramped Japanese tanks that Marines encountered in the Pacific, the Cromwell provided reasonable working space for its crew. The fighting compartment allowed the turret crew to function efficiently under most circumstances. The commander had a rotating cupola with vision blocks, though not as sophisticated as German designs. The gunner sat to the left of the main gun with his telescopic sight. The loader worked to the right, accessing ammunition stored in racks along the turret sides and hull floor. The Meteor engine, producing 595 horsepower at 2,500 revolutions per minute, gave the tank exceptional mobility. It could accelerate rapidly, crucial for the exploitation role cruiser tanks were designed for. Maximum road speed of 38 miles per hour and cross-country speed of approximately 25 miles per hour made the Cromwell faster than most contemporary tanks. The suspension, using Christie-type large-diameter road wheels, provided a relatively smooth ride and excellent terrain handling. British crews appreciated these qualities. Speed and mobility meant survival when you encountered threats you could not defeat through firepower. The ammunition load consisted of 64 rounds of 75mm ammunition, stored throughout the fighting compartment. Standard combat load included armor-piercing shot, high-explosive rounds, and smoke rounds in varying proportions depending on the mission. Armor-piercing was prioritized for units expecting tank combat. High-explosive was more common for infantry support missions. The distinction seemed academic when facing Panthers. Armor-piercing could not penetrate frontally, so crews often carried more high-explosive for bunker busting and infantry suppression. High-explosive rounds were not designed for anti-tank work. Their purpose was to create blast and fragmentation effects against unarmored or lightly armored targets. The 75mm high-explosive shell, designated Mark 1D, weighed 14 pounds and contained approximately 1.5 pounds of TNT filler. Upon impact, the round detonated, creating blast overpressure and fragmenting the steel shell casing into hundreds of pieces traveling at high velocity. Against infantry in the open, buildings, or light fortifications, high explosive was devastatingly effective. Against a Panther's 80mm frontal armor, it would do nothing except make noise and possibly annoy the German crew. Also, everyone believed the actual effects of high explosive rounds on tank vision equipment had not been systematically studied. British anti-tank doctrine focused on achieving penetration and catastrophic kills. Degrading enemy effectiveness through non-penetrating hits was not emphasized in training or tactical manuals. Crews knew that high explosive could damage external equipment, antennas, tools, stowage bins, but this was considered peripheral damage, not tactically significant. The 2nd Northamptonshire Yeomanry, part of 8th Armoured Brigade, had landed in Normandy in mid-June 1944. By mid-July, they had been in combat for several weeks, operating in the difficult bocage country south of Caen. The terrain favored defenders. Small fields bounded by thick hedgerows created natural barriers that channeled movement and provided countless ambush positions. German forces used this terrain expertly, positioning anti-tank guns and tanks at hedgerow corners where they could engage British armor at close range before withdrawing to alternate positions. The regiment had lost tanks, some to anti-tank guns, some to Panzerfausts fired by infantry, some to mines, and several to German tanks, including Panthers. Each loss reinforced the same lesson. German armor was superior in direct combat. British advantages lay in numbers, air support, artillery, and tactical coordination. Individual tank crews facing individual Panthers were at a severe disadvantage. Survival required avoiding fair fights. Operation Goodwood, launched on July 18, 1944, was an attempt to break the stalemate around Caen. The plan called for massive armored formations to push through German lines east of the Orne River, exploiting numerical superiority to overwhelmed defenders. 3 British armored divisions, 7th, 11th, and Guards, would attack on a narrow front supported by over 700 guns and extensive air bombardment. It was the largest British armored operation of the war to that point. The 2nd Northamptonshire Yeomanry advanced as part of this massive operation. The terrain was more open than the bocage, but German defences were formidable. Multiple defensive lines included dug-in Panthers, 88mm anti-tank guns, and infantry with anti-tank weapons. The villages of Kagny, Emieville, and Frenuville formed key strongpoints. As British tanks advanced across open fields toward these positions, they came under devastating fire. Lieutenant Cotton's Troop 4 Cromwell tanks was advancing toward Kagny when they encountered the hull-down Panther. The German tank had positioned itself perfectly, with only its turret visible above an earthen berm that protected the hull. At 400 yards, the Panther's commander could see the approaching British tanks clearly. The German gunner would have had an easy shot. A properly aimed round would penetrate the Cromwell's frontal armor and likely kill or wound the entire crew. Cotton faced an impossible decision with seconds to decide. Withdrawing would expose his tank's thinner side and rear armor, possibly to multiple German positions. Advancing would bring them into even more effective range for the Panther's gun, without improving the Cromwell's virtually non-existent chance of penetration. Remaining stationary made them easy targets. There was no good option, only choices between different types of probable destruction. Cotton ordered his gunner to fire high explosive at the Panther's turret. It was not a considered tactical decision based on doctrine. It was desperation. The armor-piercing ammunition was useless. High explosive might do something, perhaps damage the gun barrel, perhaps force the crew to button up, perhaps create enough blast and smoke to obscure their vision temporarily. Anything that bought time for Cotton's troop to maneuver was worth attempting. Trooper Metcalf traversed the turret, centering the Panther in his sight picture. The German tank's commander was visible in his cupola, likely directing his own gunner to engage the British tanks. Metcalf aimed high at the turret roof and cupola area, and fired. The Cromwell rocked slightly from the recoil. The high explosive round crossed 400 yards in less than a second, and detonated directly on the Panther's turret roof, just forward of the commander's cupola. The explosion was not catastrophic. There was no penetration, no internal detonation, no ammunition fire. The Panther's armor was not breached. But something happened that no one expected. The German commander, who had been standing in his cupola observing the battlefield, dropped out of sight instantly. The Panther's turret, which had been traversing to engage Cotton's lead tank, stopped moving. For several seconds, the German tank sat completely still, its gun no longer tracking targets. Cotton's driver, without waiting for orders, accelerated hard to the left, moving the Cromwell off its previous position. The other 3 tanks in the troop followed, breaking formation and maneuvering rapidly. They expected return fire any second. The Panther's gun was still capable. The tank was not destroyed. But the return fire did not come. The Panther remained stationary, its gun pointing in the wrong direction as the British tanks changed position. Metcalf loaded another high explosive round. Cotton, watching the Panther through his vision blocks, ordered him to fire again. The second round struck the Panther's turret front, near the gunner's sight. Again, no penetration, but now Cotton could see damage. One of the periscopes on the commander's cupola was shattered. The gunner's sight appeared cracked or displaced. The Panther's commander raised his head briefly from the cupola, then ducked back down. The tank began moving backward, withdrawing from its position slowly, its turret still not traversing. A third high-explosive round from one of the other Cromwells in the troop hit the Panther's glacis, the sloped frontal armor. The detonation created a shower of fragments and blast that swept across the tank's front. The driver's periscope was struck by fragments. The bow machine gun port took fragments that must have rattled terrifyingly inside the hull. The Panther accelerated backward, moving faster now, clearly attempting to break contact. Its gun fired once, a high-explosive round that detonated harmlessly in an empty field 200 yards from any British tank. The shot was not aimed, it was blind firing, desperation from a crew that could not see. The Panther withdrew behind a tree line and disappeared. Cotton's troop held position, expecting more German tanks or anti-tank fire, but the immediate threat was gone. The Panther, technically undamaged in terms of mobility and firepower, had withdrawn from a superior fighting position when engaged by tanks. It should have destroyed effortlessly, not because it was defeated in conventional terms, but because its crew could not fight blind. Cotton reported the engagement over the radio net. Other crews in the regiment were facing similar situations across the battlefield. The response to his report was initially skeptical. High-explosive rounds driving off a Panther seemed impossible, but as more crews reported similar experiences, Panthers withdrawing or becoming ineffective after being hit repeatedly with high-explosive fire, the pattern became undeniable. Something about the tactic was working. Post-battle analysis revealed what had happened. The high-explosive rounds, while unable to penetrate the Panther's main armor, were destroying or damaging the vision equipment that German crews depended on. The commander's periscopes, made of glass and relatively fragile optical components, shattered under the blast and fragmentation. The gunner's telescopic sight, protruding through an armored housing, could be knocked out of alignment or cracked by near hits. Even when the optics themselves survived, the blast and fragments created enough shock and debris that crews buttoned up completely, reducing their vision to small periscopes that could themselves be damaged by subsequent hits. A Panther with damaged optics faced a severe dilemma. The commander could expose himself in the cupola to see the battlefield, risking sniper fire, and accepting that British crews now knew to target exposed commanders with machine gun fire. Or he could remain buttoned up with degraded vision, unable to effectively direct his gunner or driver. The gunner, if his telescopic sight was damaged, lost the magnification and precision that made the Panther's gun effective at long range. He could still fire, but accuracy decreased dramatically. The driver, if his periscopes were damaged, could barely see to maneuver. Navigation became guesswork. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The psychological effect on German crews was significant. Panthers were designed to fight at range, using superior optics to identify targets and superior firepower to destroy them before enemies could effectively return fire. Blind Panthers became defensive liabilities rather than offensive assets. Crews who had been confident in their technical superiority now faced an opponent who could neutralize that superiority without destroying the tank. The fear was not of death from penetration, but of helplessness sitting in an armored box, unable to see, taking repeated hits that degraded effectiveness with each impact. British crews, conversely, experienced a psychological shift from fear to calculated aggression. They still could not destroy Panthers frontally with their main guns, but they could mission kill them, render them ineffective as fighting vehicles. A Panther withdrawing with damaged optics was as good as a destroyed Panther for immediate tactical purposes. It was not participating in the battle, it was not killing British tanks, and that was sufficient. The discovery at Kagny spread through British armored units with remarkable speed. Wireless communications between tanks during battle carried immediate tactical reports. After-action briefings that evening included discussions of the Panther engagements. Squadron and regimental commanders, initially skeptical, reviewed reports from multiple crews describing similar results. Within 48 hours, the tactic was being discussed across 8th Armoured Brigade. Within a week, it had spread to other armoured formations. The official doctrine did not change immediately. British Army bureaucracy moved slowly, and tactical manuals were not revised based on single battles, but battlefield knowledge spread through informal channels, conversations between officers, briefings before operations, advice passed from experienced crews to replacements. The message was consistent. If you encounter a Panther and cannot disengage, if you have no alternative but to fight, use high-explosive ammunition to target the optics. Aim for the commander's cupola, the gunner's sight, the driver's vision blocks. Fire repeatedly. Create cumulative damage that degrades the enemy's ability to fight. This was not a guaranteed solution. It required hitting a specific tank multiple times at ranges where the Panther could destroy the attacking tank with a single shot. It required crews to remain calm under fire, to aim carefully rather than firing wildly, and to coordinate their fire if multiple tanks were engaging the same target. It required ammunition, high-explosive rounds that might be needed for other targets. And it required luck. Panthers with alert crews could identify the threat and withdraw before sustaining critical optics damage. Panthers with infantry support could suppress British tanks with machine gun fire and anti-tank weapons, while their vision equipment was being repaired or replaced. But it was better than nothing. It gave Cromwell crews a tactical option besides withdrawal or martyrdom. And in the grinding attritional warfare of the Normandy campaign, any tactical advantage was worth exploiting. British tank losses in Operation Goodwood were severe, over 200 tanks destroyed or disabled in 3 days. But the losses would have been worse without the optics targeting tactic. Some Panthers were driven from their positions. Some withdrew for repairs when they might have continued fighting. Some German commanders became more cautious, less willing to hold forward positions when faced with massed British tank fire, even if that fire could not achieve penetration. The German response, when they recognized what was happening, was limited by resource constraints. Replacing damaged periscopes and optical equipment required spare parts that were increasingly scarce in mid-1944. German logistics in Normandy were under constant air attack. Supply convoys moved at night to avoid Allied fighters. Repair facilities were overwhelmed with battle damage from all sources. A Panther with damaged optics might wait days for replacement parts, remaining ineffective during that time. German tactical doctrine emphasized the Panther's ability to engage at long range, where its superior gun and optics provided decisive advantage. British tactics of closing range rapidly and targeting optics with high explosive fire forced Germans to fight at distances where their advantages were reduced. Panthers positioned in ambush positions, hull down with limited fields of fire, became vulnerable to massed fire from multiple British tanks that could coordinate their shots. German commanders began positioning their Panthers more defensively, with better cover and escape routes, accepting reduced offensive capability to protect their vehicles. The Battle of Normandy continued through July and into August 1944. British and Canadian forces ground forward against determined German resistance. American forces broke out at Saint-Lô and began the exploitation that would lead to the Falaise Pocket. Throughout this period, Cromwell crews continued to encounter Panthers. Each engagement reinforced the lessons learned at Kagny. High explosive fire could neutralize German technical superiority by removing their ability to see and fight effectively. Lieutenant Cotton survived the Normandy campaign. His Cromwell was hit multiple times by various weapons but never by a Panther's main gun. He credited survival to speed, aggressive maneuvering, and the willingness to fight Panthers with weapons that doctrine said were inadequate. His crew became experienced in the optics targeting technique, developing an almost instinctive sense of where to aim, how many rounds were needed, and when a Panther's withdrawal indicated successful degradation of its combat effectiveness. The tactical adaptation that began at Kagny represented something larger than a single engagement, or even a single campaign. It illustrated a fundamental principle of armored warfare that would be validated repeatedly throughout the remainder of World War II and in conflicts decades later. Technological superiority in weapon systems becomes meaningless when the crew cannot effectively employ those systems. A tank is not simply armor, firepower, and mobility. It is a weapons platform that requires human operators to see, decide, and act. Remove the ability to see, and the most powerful tank becomes a liability rather than an asset. British tank crews had discovered this principle through necessity. They lacked the firepower to defeat Panthers in direct combat according to conventional doctrine. They lacked the armor to survive prolonged engagements. What they had was sufficient firepower to destroy the fragile optical equipment that German technical superiority depended upon. And they had the tactical flexibility to exploit this weakness once it was recognized. The Panther remained a formidable opponent throughout the Northwest Europe campaign. German crews learned to adapt to British tactics, positioning their tanks more carefully, providing better infantry support to suppress enemy fire, and training crews to fight with degraded vision equipment when necessary. But the psychological advantage had shifted. British crews no longer felt helpless when facing Panthers. They had a method, imperfect and dangerous, but a method nonetheless for dealing with technically superior opponents. The evolution of this tactic reflected broader patterns in the Normandy campaign. Allied forces achieved victory not through superior individual weapon systems. German tanks, anti-tank guns, and many infantry weapons were technically superior to Allied equivalents, but through superior numbers, logistics, tactical flexibility, and willingness to adapt doctrine based on battlefield experience. American and British commanders encouraged junior officers and experienced NCOs to develop solutions to tactical problems. After-action reports were taken seriously. Successful innovations spread rapidly through informal networks. German forces, by contrast, operated within a more rigid doctrinal framework. Innovation occurred, particularly at small unit level where experienced combat leaders developed survival tactics, but the systematic evaluation and dissemination of tactical lessons was hampered by deteriorating communications. Command structure chaos as the military situation worsened, and an institutional culture that sometimes discouraged deviation from approved doctrine. German tank crews were superbly trained and often tactically proficient, but they fought within a system that was increasingly unable to support them materially or incorporate their battlefield lessons into broader doctrine. The specific tactic of targeting Panther optics with high explosive fire never became official British doctrine in the sense of being formalized in training manuals or field service regulations. It remained battlefield knowledge, passed from experienced crews to new replacements, discussed in pre-operation briefings, and employed when circumstances required. This informal transmission was actually more effective than formal doctrine might have been. Crews learned the technique in context, understanding when it was appropriate and when other tactics were better. They adapted the basic principle to specific situations, rather than following rote procedures. By September 1944, as Allied forces pursued retreating German forces across France and into Belgium, the character of armored combat had changed. German forces were increasingly on the defensive, using their armor in ambush positions and counterattacks, rather than offensive operations. Panthers remained dangerous, but they were fewer in number as losses mounted and replacement tanks became scarce. British armored regiments received increasing numbers of Sherman Fireflies, mounting the powerful 17-pounder gun that could penetrate Panther armor frontally at reasonable ranges. The need for the optics targeting tactic decreased as British firepower improved, but the lessons remained relevant. When British forces encountered German armor in subsequent operations, the fighting around Arnhem in September 1944, the winter battles in the Netherlands, the Rhine crossings in March 1945, crews remembered that technical inferiority could be overcome through tactical innovation. Panthers, and even the heavier Tiger tanks, could be defeated or neutralized by crews who understood their vulnerabilities and had the skill and courage to exploit them. The 2nd Northamptonshire Yeomanry continued operations through the end of the war in Europe. They participated in the liberation of Brussels, fought in the Netherlands during the winter of 1944 to 1945, and crossed the Rhine in March 1945, as part of the final Allied advance into Germany. The regiment's war diary records numerous engagements with German armor, gradually decreasing in frequency as German forces collapsed. By May 1945, organized German resistance had ended. The regiment found itself occupying towns in northern Germany, dealing with surrendered Wehrmacht units and displaced persons, rather than combat operations. Lieutenant Cotton was promoted to captain in August 1944 and given command of a squadron. He survived the war without serious injury, though his tank was hit numerous times, and he experienced several close calls. After demobilization in 1946, he returned to civilian life in England, rarely speaking about his experiences. Like many veterans, he found that the intensity of combat and the bonds formed with crew members were difficult to convey to people who had not shared those experiences. The tactical innovations, the fear, the satisfaction of surviving these remained largely private memories. Trooper Metcalf, the gunner who fired those first high-explosive rounds at the Panther near Kagny, was less fortunate. He was killed in October 1944 when his Cromwell was struck by a German anti-tank gun during fighting near Overloon in the Netherlands. He was 22 years old. His death illustrated the fundamental reality that tactical innovation and battlefield skill could improve survival odds, but never eliminate risk. Armored warfare in World War II was extraordinarily lethal. Crew casualties were high across all nations and all types of tanks. The human cost of the Normandy campaign, particularly Operation Goodwood, where the optics targeting tactic was discovered and refined, was severe. British and Canadian forces suffered approximately 36,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing in the 2 months of fighting from D-Day through the end of July 1944. Tank crew casualties were disproportionately high. When a tank was penetrated by anti-tank fire, survival depended on multiple factors: where the round hit, whether ammunition detonated, whether crew members were able to escape before fire consumed the interior, and whether they could reach safety under fire after bailing out. Cromwell crews had somewhat better survival rates than Sherman crews in some circumstances because the Cromwell's gasoline tank arrangement and ammunition stowage made catastrophic fires slightly less common. But both British and American medium tanks were vulnerable to German anti-tank weapons. The phrase "brewing up" became common slang among tank crews for a tank catching fire after being hit, a darkly humorous term for something that usually meant death or terrible burns for men inside. German Panther crews also suffered heavy casualties, though for different reasons. The Panther was less likely to be penetrated than Allied medium tanks, but when penetration occurred, the results were often catastrophic. The tank's internal layout, with ammunition stored along the hull sides and in the turret, meant that penetrating hits frequently ignited ammunition fires that killed the entire crew. German crews also faced increasing danger from Allied air power. Fighter bombers equipped with rockets and bombs attacked German armor relentlessly whenever weather permitted. A Panther was just as vulnerable to air attack as lighter tanks, and German air defenses were increasingly inadequate. The broader context of Panther employment in World War II reveals the limitations of technical excellence without adequate strategic resources. Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panthers during the war, from January 1943 through April 1945. This was an impressive achievement given Germany's industrial constraints and the bombing campaign against German factories. But it was inadequate for Germany's strategic situation. Panthers had to operate on multiple fronts: the Eastern Front against Soviet forces, Italy, and Northwest Europe after D-Day. Losses were continuous. Mechanical reliability, particularly in early variants, was problematic. The tank required skilled maintenance and repair, and spare parts became increasingly scarce as the war continued. The United States, by comparison, produced approximately 49,000 Sherman tanks during the war. The Soviet Union produced approximately 58,034 medium tanks. Germany's total production of all tank types during the entire war was approximately 25,000 vehicles. The numerical disparity meant that even when German tanks achieved favorable loss-exchange ratios, destroying more enemy tanks than they lost, the strategic situation continued to deteriorate. Tactical excellence could not overcome strategic material inferiority. The optics targeting tactic discovered by British crews at Kagny fit within this larger pattern. It was a tactical adaptation that helped British crews survive and accomplish missions, despite equipment disadvantages. It did not change the fundamental strategic situation. Germany was going to lose the war, regardless of individual tactical engagements. But for the men in those Cromwell tanks facing Panthers across Norman fields, strategy was abstract. Survival was immediate and concrete. The ability to neutralize a Panther, even temporarily, even imperfectly, meant living through another day. Post-war analysis by military historians and armored warfare specialists has examined the Cromwell versus Panther matchup extensively. Most conclude that the Cromwell was inadequate as a gun tank for engaging German heavy armor. Its speed and reliability made it valuable for exploitation and reconnaissance, but it should not have been placed in situations requiring direct combat with Panthers or Tigers. British doctrine recognized this, hence the development and deployment of the Sherman Firefly and other vehicles mounting more powerful guns. But doctrine and battlefield reality often diverged. Cromwell crews frequently encountered Panthers in circumstances where withdrawal was not possible or where their mission required holding ground against German counterattacks. The story of British tank crews learning to blind Panthers with high explosive fire resonates beyond the specific circumstances of Normandy in the summer of 1944. It speaks to a larger truth about military adaptation and innovation under pressure. Formal doctrine, training manuals, and pre-war planning provide frameworks for combat operations, but actual fighting requires constant improvisation. Soldiers and crews at the tactical level discover solutions to immediate problems, often solutions that would never occur to staff officers planning operations at headquarters. Modern military institutions recognize this principle and attempt to systematize it through after-action reviews, lessons learned programs, and rapid dissemination of tactical bulletins. But the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. The people doing the fighting discover what works and what does not work much faster than institutional processes can formalize and distribute that knowledge. The informal networks that spread tactical innovations, conversations between crews, advice from veterans to replacements, pre-mission briefings that incorporate recent combat experience remain more important than official publications. The specific vulnerability of tank vision equipment has remained relevant in armored warfare long after World War II ended. Modern tanks have vastly more sophisticated optics, thermal sights, laser range finders, computerized fire control systems, but these systems still require external sensors that can be damaged. Modern infantry anti-tank weapons sometimes include guidance systems designed specifically to attack tank sensors and sights. The principle that Cotton's crew discovered accidentally remains valid. A tank that cannot see cannot fight effectively, regardless of how powerful its weapons or how thick its armor. The psychological dimension of the Panther-Cromwell engagements also carries forward lessons about morale and confidence in combat. German tank crews in Panthers began the Normandy campaign with justified confidence in their equipment's superiority. British crews in Cromwells began with realistic fear of that superiority. The discovery that Panthers could be neutralized through optical damage shifted this psychological balance. German crews became more cautious, less willing to hold positions where they might take concentrated fire. British crews became more aggressive, more willing to engage even when outgunned. These psychological shifts affected tactical outcomes as much as the physical effects of damaged optics. The broader lesson from this story concerns the nature of technological advantage in warfare. Superior equipment matters enormously. The Panther was objectively a better tank than the Cromwell by almost every measurable standard. Given equal crew skill and tactical circumstances, the Panther would win almost every direct engagement. But warfare rarely provides equal circumstances. The side with inferior equipment seeks ways to negate the opponent's advantages. They find weak points, develop counter-tactics, accept risks that doctrine says are unacceptable, and adapt faster than formal military institutions can process change. Germany's strategy of developing technically superior weapons, Panthers, Tigers, Me-262 jet fighters, Type 21 submarines failed ultimately not because the weapons were ineffective, but because Germany could not produce them in sufficient quantities, and could not protect them from enemies who learned to counter their advantages. The Allies' strategy of producing good enough equipment in overwhelming quantities, combined with tactical flexibility and willingness to innovate, proved superior in the context of total war between industrial nations. For the individual crews who fought these battles, these strategic observations were largely irrelevant. They focused on immediate tactical problems: how to survive the next engagement, how to accomplish the assigned mission, how to bring their crew home alive. The discovery that high-explosive rounds could blind Panthers was not part of some grand strategic insight. It was desperate men finding a way to fight an opponent they could not defeat through conventional means. Lieutenant Cotton, looking through his commander's periscope that morning in July 1944, seeing the Panther 400 yards ahead, faced a moment that thousands of other tank commanders faced throughout the war. He had inadequate equipment for the mission. He had orders to advance. He had a crew depending on his decisions. The mathematics of armor penetration said he should not engage. But disengagement was not possible. So he ordered his gunner to fire, using ammunition that doctrine said was useless, against tanks, targeting parts of the enemy tank that were not primary targets in any training manual. What happened next, the Panther withdrawing blind and confused, was not inevitable. It was contingent on multiple factors: the accuracy of British gunnery, the vulnerability of German optics, the specific tactical circumstances, and luck, but it was also the result of human resourcefulness under extreme pressure. Cotton and his crew, and hundreds of other British tank crews in similar situations, found a way to fight when conventional methods failed. They adapted their tactics based on immediate battlefield feedback. They survived because they were willing to try unconventional solutions to desperate problems. This, ultimately, is the legacy of the story. Not that British tanks were good or German tanks were bad. The technical comparison was clear and unfavorable to British equipment. Not that clever tactics always overcome material disadvantages. They do not, and many crews died trying. But that human adaptability, tactical innovation, and willingness to experiment under pressure remain essential factors in warfare, regardless of technological sophistication. The crews in those Cromwell tanks, firing high-explosive rounds at Panther optics, were not following doctrine. They were writing new doctrine through direct experience, one engagement at a time. The Panther remained a fearsome opponent until the end of the war. But it was no longer an invincible one. British crews had learned that even technically superior enemies have vulnerabilities that can be exploited by determined opponents with sufficient skill and courage. That lesson, purchased with the lives of men like Trooper Metcalfe and hundreds of others, spread through British armoured units and contributed to the eventual Allied victory in Northwest Europe. It was not decisive by itself. No single tactical innovation determines the outcome of industrial warfare, but it mattered to the men whose lives it saved and the missions it allowed them to accomplish. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.